The priest expels homeless twins from the church. But a miracle happens before everyone. The ancient cathedral doors slammed shut with a thunderous echo that shook the very foundations of St. Mary's. Father Benedict stood in the archway, his finger still pointing accusingly at two small figures huddled in the December cold. The twin boys, no more than 10 years old, clutched their worn backpacks and stared back with eyes that held more understanding than any child should possess. "This is a house of God, not a shelter for vagrants." The priest's voice boomed across the stone courtyard, his words hanging in the frosty air like frozen daggers. What Father Benedict didn't know was that his act of cruelty was about to unleash something extraordinary. Within moments, the entire congregation would witness an event that would challenge everything they believed about faith, compassion, and divine intervention. The twins, Marcus and Gabriel, had been living on the streets since their mother's death 3 months prior, finding brief refuge in church doorways and abandoned buildings. They had come to St. Mary's, seeking not just warmth, but hope. As the heavy oak doors closed, sealing them out from the only sanctuary they'd known, something began to happen. The sky, clear moments before, suddenly darkened. A strange light began to emanate from the stained glass windows, and inside, the congregation felt an unexplainable presence filling the sacred space. Before we continue this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and comment below with your city or country. Your support helps us share more inspiring stories like this one. Now, let's witness what happened next. St. Mary's Cathedral had stood in the heart of London for over 400 years, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven like stone prayers. For generations, it had been a beacon of hope, a place where the broken came to be mended, where the lost found direction, where the hungry were fed. But somewhere along the centuries, something had changed. Under Father Benedict's leadership, the cathedral had become more concerned with appearances than with souls, more focused on preserving its pristine marble floors than on serving the community that surrounded it. Father Benedict had been appointed to St. Mary's 5 years earlier, arriving with impeccable credentials and a reputation for restoring churches to their former glory. And restore he did. The cathedral had never looked more magnificent. Every brass fixture gleamed, every statue stood perfectly positioned, every pew was polished to perfection. Wealthy donors flocked to services, their generous contributions funding elaborate renovations and expensive religious artifacts. But the poor, who had once found refuge within these walls, gradually disappeared. New rules were established. No one without proper attire could attend services, no loitering was permitted on church grounds, and absolutely no homeless individuals were allowed inside except during designated charity events, which became fewer and farther between. Marcus and Gabriel knew nothing of these politics. They only knew that their mother, in her final moments at the hospital, had pressed a small silver cross into Marcus's hand and whispered, "When you have nowhere else to go, remember that God's house is always open." Those were her last words, and the twins had clung to them like a lifeline ever since. For 3 months, they'd survived on the streets, 2 small boys navigating a world that had forgotten how to see them. They were identical in appearance, the same sandy blonde hair, the same ocean blue eyes, the same scattering of freckles across their noses, but their personalities diverged in the way that only twins can. Marcus, older by 3 minutes, carried himself with a protective seriousness, always vigilant, always planning their next move. Gabriel possessed an unshakable optimism, finding beauty in sunsets reflected in puddles and sharing their meager food with stray cats. On this particular December morning, with frost coating the city and their thin jackets providing little warmth, they had made their way to St. Mary's, drawn by the sound of hymns and the promise of shelter their mother had given them. The morning service had just begun when Marcus and Gabriel slipped through the heavy cathedral doors. They moved quietly, almost invisibly, the way they'd learned to move through the world. small shadows, seeking only to exist without causing disruption. The warmth of the interior wrapped around them like an embrace, and for the first time in days they stopped shivering. The cathedral was breathtaking. Sunlight streamed through magnificent stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the congregation. The ceilings soared impossibly high, decorated with frescoes of angels and saints. The air smelled of incense, candle wax and old wood, scents that triggered a distant memory of their mother taking them to church when they were younger, when life was simpler, when they still had a home. They found an empty spot in the very last pew, tucked into the corner where the shadows gathered. Gabriel's stomach growled audibly, and Marcus quickly covered it with his hand, shooting his brother a warning look. They needed to be invisible. They'd learned that being noticed usually meant being moved along, being shouted at, being told they didn't belong. For 20 beautiful minutes, they simply sat there, absorbing the warmth, listening to the choir's ethereal voices rise and fall. Gabriel closed his eyes, and a small smile played on his lips. "Mum would have loved this," he whispered to Marcus. Marcus nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, she would have." They didn't notice Father Benedict's sharp eyes scanning the congregation until it was too late. His gaze had caught on their dirty backpacks, their worn clothing, their disheveled hair. His face reddened with barely contained fury. This was not the image he wanted for St. Mary's, not during the service where the mayor's wife was in attendance, where wealthy potential donors filled the front pews. He strode down the center aisle, his black cassock swishing with each purposeful step. The congregation began to notice, their attention shifting from the altar to the unfolding drama. Whispers rippled through the pews like wind through wheat. Father Benedict stopped directly in front of the twins, towering over them. "You too," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the vast space. "This is not a homeless shelter. You need to leave, now." Marcus's hand instinctively found Gabriel's, squeezing tight. "Please, Father," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "We're not causing any trouble. We just wanted to pray. Our mother said—" "I don't care what your mother said," Father Benedict interrupted, his voice rising. "You're disrupting the service. You're making our congregation uncomfortable. This is a sacred space, and you're treating it like a refuge for street urchins. But isn't that what churches are supposed to be?" Gabriel's voice was small but clear. "A refuge?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment several members of the congregation shifted uncomfortably. An elderly woman in the third row looked away, her eyes glistening. A young couple exchanged troubled glances. Father Benedict's face turned crimson. "Don't presume to lecture me about what churches are supposed to be, boy. I've dedicated my entire life to the service of God. Now get out before I call the authorities." "We'll go quietly," Marcus said, standing and pulling Gabriel up with him. "We don't want to cause trouble." But as they reached for their backpacks, Father Benedict's patience, what little remained, snapped entirely. "Leave those," he commanded. "I want to inspect them. For all I know, you've stolen from the donation boxes." "We didn't steal anything," Gabriel protested, tears springing to his eyes. "We would never—" "Enough." Father Benedict grabbed both backpacks and roughly dumped their contents onto the polished marble floor. Out spilled everything the twins owned in the world. Some spare clothes, a tattered blanket they shared, a small plastic bag with toiletries they'd received from a shelter, a few precious photographs of their mother and the silver cross she'd given them. The congregation watched in growing discomfort as the priest poured through the meager belongings. Finding nothing of value, nothing stolen, he straightened up with a sneer. "Take your things and get out, and don't come back." Marcus and Gabriel scrambled to gather their possessions, their hands shaking, their faces burning with humiliation. As they stuffed everything back into their backpacks, tears streamed down Gabriel's face. Marcus's jaw was clenched so tight it ached, but he refused to cry. Not here, not in front of everyone. They walked down the center aisle, every eye upon them, the silence broken only by the soft sound of Gabriel's sobs and their footsteps echoing on the marble. Some congregation members looked ashamed, some looked away entirely, but no one spoke up, no one intervened. At the cathedral entrance, Father Benedict followed them, as if to ensure they truly left. He pulled open the heavy oak doors, letting in a blast of cold December air. "This is a house of God, not a shelter for vagrants," he declared loudly, playing to his audience. "Don't come back." He practically shoved them out onto the stone courtyard, then slammed the doors behind them with such force that the sound reverberated like thunder. Marcus and Gabriel stood in the cold, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Gabriel was crying openly now, not from the cold, or even from the humiliation, but from the crushing weight of disappointment. Their mother's promise had been a lie. God's house was not open. They had nowhere to go. "It's okay," Marcus whispered, putting his arm around his brother's shoulders. "We'll be okay. We always are." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. Inside the cathedral, Father Benedict returned to the altar, adjusting his vestments and preparing to continue the service as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and everyone could feel it. The atmosphere had shifted. The air felt heavier, charged with an inexplicable tension. "Let us continue," Father Benedict announced, his voice overly cheerful, forced. "Please turn to hymn number 47 in your—" He never finished the sentence. The sky outside, which had been clear and bright just moments before, suddenly darkened, as if a switch had been flipped. The rainbow light streaming through the stained-glass windows changed, becoming deeper, more intense, almost otherworldly. The temperature inside the cathedral dropped sharply, and congregation members pulled their coats tighter around themselves. "What's happening?" someone whispered. Then the windows began to glow. It started with the great rose window above the altar, the one depicting Christ with the children gathered around him. The glass began to emanate its own light, not reflecting the sun, but generating an impossible radiance from within. The light grew brighter and brighter until people had to shield their eyes. The glow spread to the other windows, each one illuminating in sequence. The Good Samaritan helping the wounded man, Jesus feeding the multitudes, Mary Magdalene washing Christ's feet. Every window that depicted an act of mercy, of compassion, of love for the outcast and marginalized, they all blazed with supernatural light. Father Benedict stood frozen at the altar, his face draining of color. This must be some kind of electrical malfunction," he stammered. Though everyone knew the ancient cathedral's stained glass contained no electrical components. Then the statue began to move. In the north transept stood a life-sized marble statue of Christ, arms outstretched in welcome, that had been carved in 1623. It was one of the cathedral's most treasured pieces, photographed by thousands of visitors each year. As the congregation watched in disbelief, tears began to flow from the statue's eyes, real tears, clear as water, streaming down the marble face and dropping onto the floor with soft, echoing pats. "Dear God," breathed the elderly woman from the third row, falling to her knees. But the miracles were only beginning. Outside, Marcus and Gabriel had made it halfway across the courtyard when the sky darkened. They stopped, looking up in confusion. The winter sun had vanished behind an impossible cloud formation that had appeared from nowhere, but they weren't cold anymore. Instead, a strange warmth surrounded them, as if invisible arms had wrapped them in an embrace. "Marcus, look," Gabriel whispered, pointing back at the cathedral. Every stained-glass window was glowing like a beacon, light pouring out into the courtyard in beams of red, blue, gold, and green. The effect was so beautiful, so overwhelming, that both boys stood transfixed. Then they heard it, a sound like music, but not quite. It was as if the air itself was singing, a harmony so pure and perfect that it seemed to bypass their ears and resonate directly in their hearts. Gabriel's tears stopped. Marcus's clenched jaw relaxed. They stood hand in hand, bathed in the impossible light, and felt something they hadn't felt since their mother died. Peace. Inside the cathedral, chaos had erupted. The doors had blown open of their own accord, slamming against the stone walls. The wind that rushed in carried with it the scent of roses. Impossible, as no roses bloomed in December. The congregation was on their feet, some crying out in fear, others in awe, still others in prayer. Father Benedict tried to maintain control. "Everyone, please remain calm. This is obviously some kind of natural phenomenon." But his words died as a new light appeared. This one not from the windows or the statue, but hovering in the very center of the cathedral, above the aisle, where the twins had walked in shame just minutes before. The light coalesced, grew brighter, and within it shapes began to form. People gasped, prayed, cried out. Some thought they saw angels. Others claimed to see the face of Christ himself. What everyone agreed on later was the message. Though no voice spoke aloud, every person in that cathedral heard it clearly in their mind, in their heart, in their very soul. "Whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." The words from Matthew's Gospel reverberated through each person's consciousness with the weight of divine truth. And they all knew, without question, without doubt, that they had just witnessed God's judgment on their actions, on their silence, on their complicity in casting out two innocent children. Father Benedict fell to his knees, his face in his hands. The weight of what he'd done crashed down upon him with crushing force. He had turned away Christ himself, disguised in the form of two homeless boys. He had valued marble floors over human souls, appearances over compassion, wealth over mercy. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no. What have I done?" The mayor's wife, seated in the front row, stood abruptly. Without a word, she walked down the aisle, her heels clicking on the marble, and pushed through the open doors into the courtyard. Others followed, first a trickle, then a stream, then a flood. The entire congregation poured out of the cathedral, drawn by something they couldn't name but couldn't resist. They found Marcus and Gabriel still standing in the courtyard, illuminated by the light from the windows, surrounded by that inexplicable warmth. The boys looked small and vulnerable and beautiful, their faces turned upward toward the impossible sky. The mayor's wife reached them first. She knelt down, heedless of her expensive dress on the cold stone, and gently took both boys' hands in hers. "I'm so sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "We're all so sorry." Others crowded around, apologizing, reaching out, offering help. The young couple pushed forward. "We have a spare room," the husband said. "Please, you can stay with us, as long as you need." The elderly woman from the third row approached with her own offering. "I run a foundation for children in need. Let me help you. Let me do what we all should have done from the start." Person after person came forward with offers of food, clothing, shelter, jobs, support. It was as if the entire congregation had awakened from a long sleep, seeing clearly for the first time what truly mattered. Father Benedict finally emerged from the cathedral, his face ashen, his eyes red from weeping. He walked slowly toward the twins, and the crowd parted to let him through. When he reached them, he too fell to his knees. "I have sinned," he said, his voice breaking, "against God and against you. I was supposed to be a shepherd, but I turned away the lambs. I was supposed to show God's love, but I showed only cruelty. I beg your forgiveness, though I don't deserve it." Marcus and Gabriel looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. Then Gabriel, with that eternal optimism that not even homelessness could crush, smiled. "Jesus said to forgive 70 times, 7 times, he said quietly. "If he can forgive, so can we." Marcus nodded. "Mom always said that anger hurts the person carrying it more than anyone else. We forgive you, Father." Their simple grace broke something open in Father Benedict's heart. He wept like he hadn't wept since childhood, great heaving sobs that seemed to purge years of pride and coldness and misplaced priorities. As he cried, the light around the cathedral began to fade, gradually returning to normal. The glow in the windows dimmed, the supernatural warmth dissipated, the singing in the air quieted. But something fundamental had changed, not in the cathedral, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed what had happened. The mayor's wife stood, still holding Gabriel's hand. "Come," she said gently. "Let's get you boys somewhere warm. We have a lot to talk about and a lot to make right." As the crowd began to disperse, people making plans, exchanging phone numbers, organizing help for the twins and others in need, Father Benedict remained kneeling on the cold stone. He looked up at the cathedral, this building he had polished and perfected, this structure he had valued more than the people it was meant to serve, and saw it with new eyes. It was just a building, beautiful, historic, sacred, yes, but still just a building. The true church, he realized with devastating clarity, wasn't made of stone and glass. It was made of hearts open to love, hands outstretched in service, voices raised in defense of the vulnerable. He had spent 5 years building a museum. It was time to build a church. The story of what happened at St. Mary's Cathedral that December morning spread through London like wildfire, then across the country, then around the world. Some dismissed it as mass hysteria, others as coincidence, still others as a hoax. But those who were there knew what they had witnessed. Father Benedict remained at St. Mary's, but he was a changed man. The cathedral became known throughout the city as a true sanctuary. Doors always open, meals served daily, beds available for those in need. The wealthy donors initially complained about the changes, but many found their hearts softened when they actually met the people being helped. Marcus and Gabriel lived with the mayor's wife and her family, while the elderly woman's foundation worked to find them permanent placement with relatives who had been located in Scotland. The twins thrived, returning to school, making friends, slowly healing from their trauma. But they never forgot those moments in the courtyard, surrounded by impossible light and inexplicable warmth. And neither did anyone else who was there. The lesson of St. Mary's spread far beyond that one congregation. It became a reminder that true faith isn't found in perfect buildings or flawless ceremonies, but in how we treat the least among us. That the divine often comes disguised as the desperate, the poor, the forgotten, testing not our theology, but our humanity. What did you think of this miraculous story? Please like this video, subscribe for more inspiring content, and comment below with your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an act of divine intervention? Share your story with our community.